Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're connecting from. My name is Henry Shepard, and I'm Assistant Director of the Stevens Initiative, and it's a huge pleasure to be with you all today to talk about the state of the virtual exchange field and a report that we released yesterday that we have put out to try to share what we know about this field as it grows and the dynamics that we're observing. I want to just give a little bit of grounding to what we're trying to do with this report, and then acknowledge the people who made it possible. With the survey of the field, we are trying to make it so that those across the field, as well as supporters and those curious about getting involved in virtual exchange, have a foundation of knowledge about what's happening and what practice really looks like. So we try to gather and share information from as many virtual exchange programs as possible to create a comprehensive and accurate global picture. And we want to publish new data each year so that we can all learn about how the field is evolving. There are a few things that I think this report helps make clear. The first is that virtual exchange continues to be practiced widely and continues to be a valued form of international education and exchange across countries, age levels, institution types, and fields of study. Also, this iteration certainly comes at a unique time for the field and for all of us in many aspects of our lives. We've had tremendous growth in the field in response to the pandemic. And now other kinds of programming and education and exchange are restarting. And so we're seeing several potential trends that provide a complicated picture of a field in transition. We received fewer responses to the survey this year, and respondents reported reaching fewer participants than they did last year at the height of pandemic restrictions on in-person programming. But at the same time, when we look at data from the organizations that responded to both this year's survey and last year's survey, we see growth in the number of participants and programs run by those organizations. And I know our later presenters will talk about that more. So it's not just a simple picture. This year's report also builds on our previous versions by including case studies of 5 unique programs. So we hope that by sharing more detailed descriptions from a practitioner's perspective, we can remember and learn from the vast body of knowledge that data tables and charts can only partially describe. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from today's presenters to talk about important aspects of the report, what we're seeing in the data, what we think it means about the dynamics of the field and in the programs in it, and what we're continuing to learn about the project of collecting and sharing data, which remains a work in progress, to be sure. That's why I'm really excited to recognize and thank the people who've played a significant role in making all of this possible. It takes contributions from so many corners to bring us to this kind of resource and to put us on this journey. I want to thank all over 150 organizations that responded to this year's survey. We know that it takes time not only to collect the data throughout the year, but then to sit down and actually fill out the survey that we've shared. We really, really appreciate the time that you put into it. We want to thank the advisory group that brought years of experience with different kinds of virtual exchange and with perspectives from many different world regions. It was a big addition to the process this year, and we're incredibly grateful for your guidance. I want to thank today's panelists, Amar, Jeff, and Ana Cristina. So excited to hear what they have to share, and I'm so glad that we're sharing perspectives on their programs in the report. I want to thank Rajika Bandari and Melkin Ramos for carrying out the project with the tireless effort and thoughtfulness that we valued in our years of work together. I want to share a heartfelt thanks to everybody on the Stevens Initiative team who made this possible. To Kyle Kassler, who managed the project from start to finish, and Rowan Nasir, who worked with Kyle. To Haley Lewis, who played a leading role in the production of the publication and this launch event, and Gabby Hunt, who worked with Haley, and to the other colleagues who shared the survey with our practitioners and took many other helpful steps. So I'm really pleased to turn it over to Rajika, who is an international education expert, a scholar practitioner, and the founder of Rajika Bandari Advisors. Rajika, it's always a pleasure to see you and work with you and to celebrate the culmination of a really special project. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Henry, for your wonderful words of welcome, and so delighted to join you today. At this time, I'm also going to ask Melkin to join me for the presentation as I get our data loaded up and ready to go. So nice to have you here, Melkin. And I'll just say a word. Melkin has worked closely with me on this project, and I'm delighted to be partnering with him. And if you all give me just a moment, I will share my PowerPoint presentation that we are going to share with you today. Okay, I think we're set. So as Henry shared, this is the third survey in a row that the Stevens Initiative has carried out with the attempt to globally map virtual exchange as it's playing out around the world. And I would say that the last two surveys, the one before and this one, have really occurred at a critical point in time because they have also aligned at the same time as the pandemic, and we see some interesting impacts of that. Let's see here. I'm just trying to advance my presentation. Give me a moment. Sorry, apologies. My screen seems to have frozen for a moment. Oh, there we go. Okay. So just a very quick overview. There's the very nice cover of the new report that's gone live. Yesterday, actually, was the launch. And through this report, we covered programs around the world that were implemented between September 2021 and August of this year. And a really important aspect of this survey, including the one last year, is that this survey is not just about the US, it's much beyond. And we've really tried to stay true to its global nature, capturing exchanges that are also happening in other parts of the world amongst different countries. As Henry mentioned, there are a couple of new and exciting elements this year. One of the pieces is that what we had learned through the previous survey last year was that many large providers of virtual exchange are also playing a critical role in providing training to the field. And so this new survey and its findings does begin to capture some of that, of the role that virtual exchange providers play not only in implementing their own direct programs, but also how they're providing critical training and learning for the field. We also, for the first time, have some data on who actually facilitates or teaches within virtual exchange programs. And so we've begun to capture some of that with the hope of building even more in the future. And then Henry mentioned the 5 case studies, which I will speak a little bit more on later. And then the final really exciting piece of the report this year is that now that we have 3 years of data, with the first year of the survey sort of being the first year, but the second and third year offering more stable data, it gives us the ability to actually look at some change over time. And again, I will speak more to that later on, but I want to now turn it over to Melkeen, who's going to walk us through some of the data highlights.
Thank you, Rajika, and I'm excited to dive into the data for a bit for the next few slides. So as you can tell, this year we received 155 respondents from providers that implement virtual exchange programs. And out of those 155, 147 of them indicated that they offered at least one or more programs during 2021, 2022. And of those 147 providers, 126 of them were able to provide more detailed information about their programs, as you can see on this slide. And as Henry mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we did see a smaller number of respondents and a smaller number of programs, which Rajika will speak to a little later in the presentation. And for the third year in a row, the higher education sector had the highest level of representation in the survey, which can be due to a combination of factors. For example, it's possibly that the higher education institutions have more capacity to collect and report on this data. And it could also be the case that the survey reached more higher education institutions than any other type of organizations or providers, which you can read a little bit more about in the report, and it's something that we'll continuously mention. But overall, most virtual exchange providers, about 60%, have been offering virtual exchange programs for 1 to 5 years. But it's also important to mention that the current and previous survey have taken place during the pandemic, So there are many providers that are newer to this work, and in some ways, the pandemic has served as a catalyst for virtual exchange as well. On this slide here, you'll be able to see that similar to last year's survey, most participants were students enrolled in higher education institutions, over 50%, which isn't surprising since we do see a predominance of higher education institutions that responded to the survey. But a key finding in this year's report is that we see learners of all levels participating in virtual exchange. We recognize that for some providers, it may be difficult to report on this data because some virtual exchange participants may identify as more than one education or age level, for example, identifying as both a mid-career professional and a higher education learner. So to the extent possible this year, we encourage providers to classify their participants into one age or educational level. And as this graphic illustrates, virtual exchange is happening globally. It's happening in all corners of the world. And these are the top 10 countries that reported the highest number of programs serving participants in those countries. And even though we know anecdotally where students are coming from, it can be a challenge for providers to collect and report on the number of students per country or per territory, which is something we discuss a bit more in the report as well. And not surprisingly, the US is number one, followed by Brazil, and then by France. But as we described in the report, this finding should be interpreted with caution because it's not clear whether this reflects the predominance of participants in these countries or whether it's a function of the organizations that responded to the survey, many of whom are headquartered in the United States. And classifying virtual exchange isn't easy, but the Stevens Initiative has been working on refining classifications and typologies over the past few years. And we look at that framework to broadly define or classify what virtual exchange looks like. So as you can see on this screen, you'll see different types of program administration types. And the most common type of virtual exchange program reported is a collaborative online international learning or COIL course, many of you might already implement these into your courses. And even though we try to classify programs, we recognize that some don't fit neatly into each of these categories, which is something that Rajika will be able to speak to as well. And similar to our findings last year, most virtual exchange programs offer a blend of asynchronous and synchronous approaches to delivering virtual exchange programs, it seems that these are the two components that are most important in creating these type of virtual exchanges. And the most common virtual exchange program lasts between 5 to 6 years. But we do see a predominance of English as being the language of delivery, which can be due to many factors, including where the virtual exchange programs take place, the providers who responded, many of whom are headquartered in the US, as we mentioned, and the survey was conducted only in English for this year. This year, we also reported on the most common languages other than English that were used in virtual exchange programs, which include Spanish, French, Portuguese, Mandarin, Chinese, Japanese, and Arabic. And to finalize this section, we see that virtual exchange programs are multidisciplinary, covering various content or topic areas. And the top 3 reported include intercultural dialogue or peace building, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics or STEM, and entrepreneurship or business. And this year, entrepreneurship or business replaced global or international affairs as the 3rd place content or topic area. And now I'll turn it over to Rajika to discuss the implications of our findings.
Thank you so much, Melkeen. And I want to go back to something that we started with and that Henry mentioned, that we're really seeing a shifting landscape of virtual exchange. And this is due in part to the pandemic. So although we saw fewer programs responding, we saw fewer providers responding this year, we saw fewer programs reported as well as fewer participants, we also saw growth. Now, what I mean by that is, again, when we're really trying to measure change and growth, we need to compare apples to apples and really compare the same entities that have responded to more than one survey. And I'm happy to share we were able to do that for 71 organizations or institutions. And here there was good news. So for providers who responded both to the survey last year and this year, we actually see growth. It's a good news story where we find that the number of programs that the subset of 71 implemented actually increased by 38%. So if we are to consider that as sort of consistency over time, we can say that there has been growth in virtual exchange programs. Amongst the same subset, we also, because we see a growth in programs, we also saw a 22% growth in the number of participants. So this is very good news. This is sort of one of the highlights from this year. That being said, where most of the growth is coming from is really amongst higher education institutions. And Melkeen has already mentioned this a few times, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But one of the things about the survey and the findings is that overall, we see a much larger response from the higher education sector. And it can really be due to a mix of factors that Melkeen also identified. But the reality is that where we've seen growth, it's really been in virtual exchange programs provided by colleges and universities. I want to say a little bit about the 5 case studies that we did this year, and that we really see is taking the reader through the journey of what virtual exchange has been like for the 5 organizations or institutions that we have featured. Their work is truly global, where we have covered their programs. The programs we featured have covered France, Mexico, South Africa, Libya, and the US. And as a result, we've really been able to surface both the opportunities for leveraging virtual exchange, but also the challenges that these very different 5 entities encounter on a day-to-day basis. And I would really encourage you to read these case studies. They're fascinating. I feel I learned so much beyond the data of the survey, and they really take us behind the scenes and into the context of issues such as, for countries in the global south, that has technology actually opened doors, or do we actually face continuing digital divides in virtual exchange? We hear about the importance of leadership and commitment from the top in sustaining virtual exchange, and a host of other really key topics that we were not able to get to through the survey, but that are really illuminated through these case studies. A few quick closing thoughts on what can we take away from the findings. Going back to something that Melkeen already mentioned, defining and classifying virtual exchange continues to be a challenge. I think the work that the Stevens Initiative is doing, and all of its other work, and through this survey, is a really important step in that direction to continue to attempt to measure, to classify. But it is not easy, because the more global we attempt to be through this survey, obviously the more complex the picture of what constitutes virtual exchange. I want to touch upon sort of the challenge of building a pool of consistent respondents. So one of the reasons why we've had these fluctuating responses in the second year of the survey and this year is that each year we've seen different entities responding. And of course, the survey is still 3 years in, and as it matures, that pool of programs that are being, or the pool of providers who are reporting data will stabilize. And this year we saw 71 that had responded in both years. So the takeaway here is, please respond to the survey. If you are someone who provides virtual exchange and you did not respond to the survey, we really urge you to consider responding next year, because this is what will really help build the reliability and credibility of the data. We've really made an effort to understand what virtual exchange truly looks like around the world without it being a very US-centric view. And the case studies have also really helped with that. And as I said a minute ago, really understanding what the context is for virtual exchange and how it's playing out in different world regions. And then lastly, the really important role of training, which we've begun to tap into with this year's survey, but we will hopefully do more around that in next year. So looking ahead, just some quick 5 takeaways. We identified this last year, and I think that it's an ongoing gap, that we need to know more about the quality of virtual exchange, because it's not just about the number of participants or where it's occurring, but again, what's really happening on a day-to-day basis, and what is the quality of that experience for the participants. We need a deeper understanding of the role of those who impart virtual exchange. What sort of professional development is needed for them? What's the ratio and proportion of facilitators versus participants? And so these are all unanswered questions that we need to look at more in the future. I talked a little bit about training and understanding that as distinct from programs. And then the last 2 are really areas which we also identified last year, that a lot more needs to be done in the space of continuing to build the capacity across the entire virtual exchange sector to really gather and report virtual exchange data. And I think the survey is a much needed step in that direction. But at the same time, programs also need to emphasize how to assess their own outcomes and impact. And in fact, in the 5 case studies, we do ask. That's one thing we asked about, and you'll get to hear what some other programs are doing. And with that, I will wrap up this portion of the presentation and turn it back to Rowan. So.
Thank you, Rajika and Malkeen, for such a thorough presentation and walkthrough of this year's survey results. I'm Rowan with the Stevens Initiative, and it is great to be here with you all today. Before I kick us off with our first interview, I want to remind our audience to please submit any questions you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will have time after our interviews to address these questions, so please make sure to put them in the box. And now we can get started, and I invite Ahmad to please join us on screen.
Thank you, Rowan.
Ahmad El-Hajmi is a program officer with the Leaders of Tomorrow's Digital Exchange program. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Ahmad.
Thank you, Rowan.
If you will, let us start off with you sharing a brief overview of the virtual exchange program you reported on in the survey, as well as some overall reflections on the survey as you were submitting a response.
All right, great, thank you. So Leaders of Tomorrow Digital Exchange Program has been operating since 2019, and it is based in Iraq. It is a cultural exchange program for youth. We basically have 2 programs, one for teenagers. The first one is for teenagers between the ages of 14 to 17 years old. And the second program is for youth adult or young adult between the ages of 18 to 24. The program mainly focuses on building capacity for youth and training and participants from all over the world. Reflecting on our participation with the survey for this report, we have been involved with the Stevens Initiatives before, even prior to the pandemic. And we have found that the research methods that the Stevens Initiative that has been developing and is still developing really helped us a lot in building our own model for this virtual exchange program and have understanding of what's going on around the world, what other virtual exchange are doing, and also to ensure we have to adapt to new evaluation methods and also procedures. So looking at the survey and participating in the survey gives us the courage to the encouragement to participate more and learn more about this research and this survey. Therefore, we felt it's very important to participate and share our experiences as we learn from others who share their experiences in this very newly emerging field. So it's important to do and conduct such research. And we also would like to appreciate and thanks the efforts the Stevens Initiative is doing for this report and survey, as it brings us to a bigger network and have more understanding of other virtual exchange.
Thank you so much for first sharing that overview of your program and also those reflections on the survey. We appreciate it. We know that the program you work to implement includes students from the K-12 age level. We saw that most respondents, as Rajika and Malkeen mentioned, to the survey were from higher education institutions. What are your reflections on why K-12 isn't highlighted as much, and why do you think it's important that virtual exchanges at that age level are captured as well?
That is correct. Thank you, Rowan. So in our first couple of years, we were only working with students who are 14 to 17 years old. But as our resources expanded, and for the last 2-3 years, we started to include more young adults, as we mentioned, between 18 and 24. The main target by working with this group of this age area is to provide, first of all, a free international experience to virtually connect with youth, mainly from Iraq, but also from other countries, around 35 countries from around the world. Most of our participants actually come from less privileged socioeconomic backgrounds and mostly also developing countries. Therefore, we believe that this virtual experience will help them to connect, learn new skills, and also seek mentorship to implement local projects or national projects to improve their personal skills, but also their societies, and be agent of change makers. Our targeted students usually do not have a lot of skills between this age area, and they do not possess their qualified experience in project planning or public speaking and other areas or skills. So we try to give them that training through our culturally focused exchange program. Therefore, we try to give them this opportunity to also make friendships globally and be part of the globalization and all of that, but as well as learning important life skills to help them develop their home societies. This is not usually the case for students who are in this age area, as usually undergraduate students will have more access to opportunities based on their experiences. This is why we feel it's more important to target this age area and also give them this experience.
Thank you so much, Ahmad, for those responses. I will now turn us to our second interview, and I invite Ana Cristina to please join us on camera.
Hello.
Hi, nice to see you. Dr. Ana Cristina Salamo is Assistant Provost for International Affairs at Sao Paulo State University in Brazil. It's so great to have you with us. Would you please start off by sharing a few words about the virtual exchange programs you reported on in the survey, and then share your overall reflections on the survey process as a whole?
Yeah, sure. So back in 2017, so it's pre-pandemic, FAUBAI, which is the Brazilian Association for International Education, launched the Brazilian Virtual Exchange Program, which we call BRAVE, yes, BRAVE, to promote virtual exchange in higher education in Brazil. UNESP, my university, was one of the pioneers to join, as we had already experienced with telecollaboration projects since 2006. So we have worked with FAUBAI to promote workshops associated with the development of institutional virtual exchange programs, so that all universities in Brazil can have the BRAVE seal, as long as they fulfill the requirements that FAUBAI establishes. And the most important one is to have a coordinator for virtual exchange at the universities, at the institutions. And this is one of my main roles at UNESP. This has been since 2018, and we currently have one of the largest BRAVE programs in Brazil. I think it's very important to have a central coordination to organize virtual exchange as an institutional initiative and gather the data, which will be important to answer the survey, for example, yes, and to the survey, and of course the data that is important for the institution. We have submitted responses to the survey every year in the last iterations, and I can say that filling the survey has also given me insights on what kind of information I should be gathering about our virtual exchanges at UNESP. So we can say that the survey contributes to the field, as well as contributes to institutions' reflections and plans on how to keep track of what's happening.
Thank you so much for that helpful overview of your work and also insightful reflections on the survey. And we know that the survey of the virtual exchange field report overrepresents U.S. institutions and organizations. So from your perspective, how do you think we can effectively reach, engage with, and incentivize organizations across the globe to respond to this survey effort?
Well, I believe the landscape of virtual exchange at large is still composed of individual initiatives by professors attempting to innovate in their pedagogical practices. But there is a growing interest, especially in higher education, to institutionalize and scale virtual exchange, as the survey is also showing. As in Brazil, we have the BRAVE program, which is an initiative to make it happen, to institutionalize virtual exchange. One thing that might help bring attention to the survey is to work closely with stakeholders from both public and private sectors and international education associations to show how the survey informs and benefits VE, and may also empower stakeholders and policymakers to think about institutional policies on internationalization, especially internationalization at home, as virtual exchange regarding national and regional agendas. And one more thing I consider important to reflect, specifically considering the linguistic aspect of the survey, perhaps adding the possibility of answering the survey in another language rather than English might also have a positive effect on participation. In Latin America, for example, perhaps a version of the survey in Spanish would encourage people to answer. Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Anna. We will now move to our third interview, and I invite Jeff to please join us on screen. Dr. Jeff Bradshaw is the Associate Vice President of Intercultural Education at Madison Area Technical College.
Thank you, Rowan.
Great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. If you could please start off with a brief overview of the virtual exchange programs you reported on in the survey, and then your overall reflections on this survey effort as a whole.
Yes, thank you. So Madison Area Technical College, or Madison College, is a community college in Madison, Wisconsin. And particularly for community colleges, it's really important to have the access opportunity for students who have jobs, families, might not be able to participate in travel-based programs. And so this has been a real important access initiative for us. We received a Coronavirus Response Fund Award from the Stevens Initiative in 2020 that we used to integrate virtual exchange collaboration with a partner in Qatar into 2 different business courses, one in entrepreneurship and one in marketing. In entrepreneurship, students worked in small groups to integrate UN Sustainable Development Goals and talk about strategies for student engagement to address them. And in marketing, students explored the concept of kindness as represented in different cultures and created what they called a museum of kindness by contributing images and video to a Padlet discussion board. And since that initial work, we've rolled out virtual exchange in multiple other disciplines. And so across our language courses, Spanish, French, Chinese, we're actually looking for a partner in Arabic. So if somebody wants to contact me afterwards, we're looking for an international partner. But entrepreneurship, marketing, event management, journalism, African history, and we're in the midst of integrating it into several other courses as we speak. And so I was really pleased to be able to contribute to this survey, in particular because I really value the role the Stevens Initiative is playing in professionalizing virtual exchange as a field unto itself within international education. And through the survey, through the tools, through the resources and advocacy, the Stevens Initiative is not only promoting communication and relationships between the US and the MENA region, but helping the institutions to formalize virtual exchange as a key piece of our portfolios. And so while COIL and other exchange programs have been around for some time, overall, virtual exchange remains a relatively new pedagogy for international education, and the survey really bears this out, with 60% of survey respondents indicating only 1 to 5 years of experiences with programs. And so by collecting this data, submitting that, participating in that, this is playing an important role in helping to make this a mainstay within international education portfolios, and I'm pleased to help with that in any way that I can.
Thank you so much, Jeff. As you mentioned, Madison College received a grant in 2020 for trainings, and this report captures data on institutions and organizations that ran trainings for virtual exchange. So based on your experience, could you talk about how investing in trainings can lead to wider virtual exchange implementation?
I think this is one of the most important aspects of that, and one of the things that this survey particularly highlights as well. But less so perhaps for this audience, but for people who are just thinking about virtual exchange, there's this common misperception that's as simple as throwing together students in a video chat and letting them talk. And that's not true at all. And I think part of the professionalization of the field that I just discussed is about raising awareness of the importance of training and sharing and planning of best practice to set up students and faculty for success as we go into programs. And my advocacy around this has been that institutions should approach virtual exchange with the expectation that it will take as much pedagogical preparation to run a virtual exchange program with quality as it will to run a study abroad program. It's not as expensive. It doesn't have the travel, logistics, and risk management that a study abroad program has, but it does require the same level of intentionality when we think about setting up faculty and students to communicate appropriately. And so through our award, we were introduced to the body of best practice that was collected with the Stevens Initiative, as well as some seed funding that really allowed us to grow our training plan to engage faculty around this work. And there are lots of lessons that we learned along the way, including some mistakes, but some of the key pieces were spending time for the faculty and facilitators to build rapport was as important as the time for students to engage as well. We can't assume that faculty have a knowledge or understanding of this as a pedagogy without some training and background in it. And I really found the taxonomy of virtual exchange tool that the Stevens Initiative has provided as a really valuable way to think through the intentional choices as we go into that, and to understand that those choices we make about the technology platform, about the way that we communicate, about synchronous versus asynchronous learning versus cultural respect, all have implications as we build out those programs moving forward. And so we've been really pleased to have the opportunity to build that training, but it's really a critical piece to set faculty up for success.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jeff, for your responses. I'll now ask all three of our panelists to join us on camera for one final rapid fire question. And so, Anna, Christina, and Ahmad, good to see you back on screen. We want to hear from each of you in about a minute. If you could please respond through your participation in the survey or through reading the report, what key takeaways will influence future programming, seeking buy-in from your institution, for example, or other aspects of virtual exchange planning and implementation? And whoever is ready to respond, just feel free to unmute and share.
Well, I can say something about that. I think the survey brings about key information to work closely with stakeholders in the institutions with quantitative and qualitative data. Because of course, numbers will have a strong influence in making the case, but I think that the case studies are very important to help people understand how specific goals, expectations, and roles are different in different structures. So what I especially like about the survey is this chance to understand that these different structures of virtual exchanges through the case studies. I think they're very important. They will be very important for us too. And I would just like to say that next year, the IVAC 2023, this is the conference of the International Virtual Exchange Consortium, will be in Brazil, in São Paulo, and I'm sure it will be a great chance also to inform and integrate more the Latin American community in VDE practices in all sectors. I'm sure the survey will also be a lot of help as to help spread the virtual exchange idea in Latin America and also in the IVAC in São Paulo in 2023, yes.
I'm happy to respond as well. And so since we began our virtual exchange journey at Madison College, I have become a real vocal proponent of virtual exchange as being a key piece, a fundamental part of a well-rounded internationalization strategy, but also really advocating that this means investing time and planning and staffing to do this work, and that it also takes advocacy with our international partners as part of this. And so one of the things we've done is to make this a default deliverable within our partnership MOUs when we're talking about working with our partners, and to talk with them about what this means. But one other thing I would just suggest briefly is that we also, even though the word virtual exchange is deeply embedded in the way that we think about it, is that we may want to rethink the word virtual and think about the ways that technology is integrated into our life as part of the way that we really interact as we move forward. And our daily lives, especially since the pandemic, include mediated communication with people all over the world. And by integrating intentional conversations with peers into the fabric of daily life for our students, we can help build a new kind of globally connected citizenship that is more than virtual, that's part of how we engage with the rest of the world.
I would also like to answer your question, Rowan. We are currently studying the types of activities that the report has mentioned and the methods of implementation as we're developing our plan for next year's program to be ensure within certain standards and what our other programs are following to achieve those activities. And we are also studying possible target countries that the report has covered, that there are not a lot of programs that have been implemented there, and as part of our mission to increase this opportunity and provide it for all those who do not have the same access. So we'd also to work on those target countries. And also, it helped us to understand the context of virtual exchange, as Jeff mentioned as well. It is important to understand, for us, basically, for the past 4 years, virtual exchange meant only cultural exchange and some training workshops. But here, looking at all the academic or other job-related virtual exchange and how other countries and other organizations are achieving those programs, is very important to understand the widened perspective and horizons of those virtual exchange programs. And also, I think it will definitely help us in putting better plans for funding opportunities to put more studies into this field and this research.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for sharing those thoughtful responses. And with that, that concludes our interview portion for today's event, and we will now move into our Q&A session. And my colleague Kyle has joined us on screen.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I've just really enjoyed the long presentation so far. I'll invite all of our participants so far, Rajika, Malkeen, Henry, to join us back on camera to think about some of the questions we've had coming into the question box throughout this presentation. And so we have some minutes left, so I'm going to try to get through as many as we can. And so maybe the first question I want to direct to Rajika and Malkeen is just a recap or a review of some of the big picture numbers that we presented at the beginning of this event. And so can you remind us, Rajika and Malkeen, first, how many respondents we had for this report versus last year's report? And then I think there's some confusion about maybe after that we could talk a little bit more about the reasons for the lower response rate, what that implies for overall participants and numbers, and then maybe we'll talk about the repeat respondents after that. So I know that's a lot, but Rajika, Malkeen, I'll turn that over to you guys to talk about the numbers.
Definitely. I can answer the numbers question, and Rajika, if you would like to lead on the implications of what that means.
Sure.
So as a reminder, last year we received 233 organizations, and this year we received 155 responses. Out of the 233 last year, 214 of them were able to submitted that they reported offering virtual exchange. And then more granularly, 177 were able to actually provide more detailed programs. Versus this year, we had 147 respondents who reported offering virtual exchange in 2021, 2022, and we had 126 respondents who were able to provide more detailed programs about those virtual exchange programs.
Yeah, and I'll also just add that I think part of that question may also be so last year, as Malkeen said, we had over 200 total organizations who responded, and they reported 3,000 plus programs. I'm of course sharing big broad numbers here, and over 200,000 participants. So this year it's obviously been a smaller number as we presented. And we really think this is due to a mix of reasons, and Henry addressed this a little bit, but I think one of the things is that last year we saw sort of this big bump, if you will, in sort of new providers, more programs being launched, etc. Because in some ways, there was no other way for people to engage, right? There was only the option of something virtual or online. And this year, when we saw some of those responses go down, our interpretation has been that for those organizations who have sort of looked to all of this as kind of a quick fix or a quick stopgap solution to offering some sort of engagement in the absence of physical mobility, some of those, for some of them, their virtual exchange may not have sustained, because I think Jeff sort of laid this out beautifully on the kind of investments and strategic approaches that are required to really sustain virtual exchange. And that's one thing that really emerged in the case studies as well, that there's sort of this myth that virtual exchange is sort of quick and it's easy and it's cheap. And it's anything but, because it requires a lot of intentionality. So I think some of the responses that we have seen go away from last year may have literally been like, those stopgap solutions. But then, that group, that subset of 71 is sort of that sustained subset. And I would hope that, in continuing years, the survey will begin to really capture what is that core of serious, sustained providers who are really not only engaging in virtual exchange from year to year, but also really building up their capacity to report the data.
Yeah, thank you for that comprehensive response, both Melkeen and like the raw numbers, and then Rajika, that analysis. I wholeheartedly, from my own view, agree. I think it's a complicated question and a complicated answer about like the response rate for this year, and I'm really excited to see those 70 some organizations that responded both years, and then hopefully, plug here, to respond again next year, so we see what that growth looks like year after year. I think that's really important. And I also noticed Jeff, Anna, and Amar all kind of smiling and nodding when you mentioned that virtual exchange isn't easy. It requires effort, it requires money, it requires a lot, just a lot from people who want to do it. And so I think that rings true if I can gauge from the reactions. We received a question about other institutions, organizations, efforts globally to do the kind of work that the Stevens Initiative does. For example, do any other governments or organizations invest substantially in virtual exchange? Kind of asking about the question asked about trends in international government sponsorship of virtual exchange. I know we have some representation on here from different parts of the world with different experiences there. Maybe I could start off, and maybe I'll ask Anna or Rajika from the case studies your perspectives on this. I know there are many efforts in different parts of the world, and there have been from the European Union, from others. I know our advisory group that's mentioned in the report represents some international efforts to advocate for and to implement and to support virtual exchange. And so I wonder, what sort of consortia, what sorts of organizations, institutions do we see really represented here, either in the report or in our work to implement the survey? Maybe Anna, I ask you what your perspective is in South America or in Latin America, and then Rajika, your other thoughts.
So right now there are no governmental initiatives to support virtual exchange in Brazil or in Latin America. The initiatives, they come from higher education institutions, especially in Brazil. And I could say in Latin America too, there's a network, there's the Latin American COIL network, the Latin COIL, which was formed 2 or 3 years ago. So this is a network of universities based in Latin America who want to incentivize virtual exchange in the region, but there are, as far as I know, it's usually the resources come from the universities. Some are funded by the government, but there isn't an initiative from the government, not yet. We'll have to convince the stakeholders in this case. Yes, but we're working on that.
Yeah, and hopefully the survey helps, right?
To
convince stakeholders. So yeah, thank you for that. Rajika, I wonder what your thoughts are about this.
Yeah, I was going to echo, Kyle, what you had said, that there is a lot of activity around this, I think, in various European countries, at the country level, at the national strategy level, and then, of course, through Europe-wide initiatives like Erasmus and others, where virtual exchange is a key component. So I think we are seeing a lot of that governmental push in Europe. One country that comes to mind is also France, which actually popped up in two of our case studies, the one with Gazelle International and their work with community colleges, and the case study with the Smithsonian Institution. When both cases, the partnership on the French side was fueled by governmental initiatives and virtual exchange. And one of the really interesting points made, I believe, in the Gazelle International case study for the CLICK program was that there's been a real shift in France. And again, it's sort of not just thinking, and I think Jeff was alluding to this, not just thinking about virtual exchange as something off on the side, but that it's a core aspect of internationalization strategy. And I think that's the shift we're beginning to see in some national level policies, and France included, where there's physical mobility, there's in-person mobility and exchange, but it's not a zero-sum game. The virtual piece is also fully integrated into academic requirements now of what students are expected to engage in as part of their credentials.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you both for those insights. I want to go to our respondents that we have on today, our interviewees, for our next question. And maybe since Anna just asked, we'll go to Jeff or Amar first, whoever wants to take this question about like challenges to completing the survey, and then recommendations for people who might fill it out next year. So if one of you would like to share, what were some of the challenges you came across filling out the survey this year? Maybe getting your institutional data or program data together, or having the data that you needed, and maybe how can institutions or programs prepare for next year's survey now?
I can start with that. I think that this is a challenge for international programs in general, is that we need to be proactive as we build our programs to think about what is the data reporting that we need for them on the other side. And so within mobility programs, things like Open Doors have kind of driven us to think about, okay, we're going to need to collect these kinds of numbers. And so I think the survey has been useful in helping us to think about how we build programs to collect that information, because we didn't have all the information at our fingertips to think about how we respond to that. And so, we're a small enough program that we could go back to things and work with my team and say, please gather this information for this. But as we build this, to think about, well, how do we collect that? How do we report on that? And how do we self-assess? As you were saying, Rajika, one of the kind of recommendations and things that came out of the case studies as well is, how do we use this to self-assess our progress, and having that good data is a key part of that as well.
Yes, also for our side, being respondents is the first version of this survey and this report definitely helped us into knowing exactly, as Jeff said, which data should we incorporate in our application or our data gathering, and that helped us like throughout the other years to easily access this data and report them. But also like a challenge that I personally faced when I was first filling the survey was the, let's say, the terminology that was used and different names of activities. And thankfully, I think the Stevens Initiative had their own toolkit for defining certain terminology that definitely helped me to understand which kind of activities should we talk about and also understand during the survey. So that's also a useful tool that we personally used in filling this survey.
I agree with both of them. And as I said during the interview, I think the survey has helped us to understand better the kinds of data we have to collect and how we should proceed on that, to help ourselves as well. It's like, oh, this is important data for the survey, this is important data for our institution. So I recommend reading the survey, understanding the kind of data that is the survey provides, and trying to build a plan on how to collect this data at one's own institution.
Yeah, these responses are really great. They remind me that the survey serves, and the report from the survey serves many functions. One tells us a lot about what's happening. It might inform how we, and this a question we got is, how will the Stevens Initiative use some of the information in this survey to to improve or to affect the type of work we do. I think that reminds me, the survey isn't only just tells us what's happening in the field. It tells us, like what different programs look like, and reminds us that like terminology, descriptions of programs, program characteristics all remain kind of nebulous or different from program to program. And so there's a lot of work to be done around providing resources to help organizations or virtual exchanges to define what their programs are, to share that information, and then, as you all are saying, to like be prepared to report some kind of consistent data over the years. And all of that comes together to make programs better, to help think about new types of virtual exchange programs to meet different learners' needs, and also to advocate to different funders, whether that's government institutions or whether that's local education institutions, to provide more virtual exchange opportunities. So we're going to wrap up here. I'm going to have one last rapid fire question for a couple people to respond to. We did receive a question about, how do we access the information in this report? So it's on the Stevens Initiative website. If you go to stevensinitiative.org and our resources tab, you'll see the survey of the field highlighted. And on that page, all of the respondents to this year's survey are listed, and their websites, when available, are hyperlinked, so you can find out more about the virtual exchange programs there. Also, attendees of this webinar will be added to our contact list, and so you'll be hearing from us about other resources and opportunities like next year's survey of the field. And so I think that's great. Maybe I'll ask just one or two people to share, a final recommendation for attendees at this webinar, what they can do with the survey of the field now that we've launched it. So maybe Rajika, I can start with you, and then if someone else wants to share also.
Yeah, and I'm just going to, rather than offer anything new, just reiterate something really important that both Jeff said and Kyle, you said. That, Jeff, you're absolutely right. A large part of reason for doing this survey is to really create that culture of evidence. That how do we know where we are going as a field if we're not in some ways capturing it in data and evidence? So, which is why we're not dismayed that fewer programs responded this year, because I think the data, it takes some time for a survey and an effort like this to stabilize and really build, and we need everyone to respond. And each year we adapt the survey, we improve it based on the response that we're getting. So I would say that my call to action is, please immerse yourselves in the findings, use them for advocacy, like you said, Kyle. Tell the Stevens Initiative about what else they should be measuring through this survey, and respond, because that's how we'll know what's working and not working. So that's my call to action.
Absolutely. I know maybe we'll pause right there. I think that's a perfect call to action. And I'll just remind people to follow us on our social media handles for the Stevens Initiative. We want to say thank you to everyone who attended today, all of the panelists here, to Rajika and Malkeen for helping us put together such a great report that we hope will really help all practitioners in the field of virtual exchange. And we look forward to starting the survey effort again next year to keep learning more about the growth of this important international learning opportunity. So I want to wish everybody here and everybody watching a happy International Education Week. And we look forward to connecting with you from the Stevens Initiative in the future. So thanks, everybody.